looks like we're live.
So good, very early morning to our thousands of CFAD fans in London who have gotten up especially just to see this incredible production.
You know they did because they had it on their calendar.
So Andrew, I was just asking you about.
I still understand why Ben. One sec, Ben. He doesn't put his camera on for this, but then he puts his camera on for meetings during the day. I understand. He also mutes himself for no reason.
Well, no, there is a reason.
Echo thing that like talk.
Well, hello.
Do you get an echo?
Let's see. Looks like no.
No, then it's just you, Bear.
Okay.
Take it all back.
Well, no, it's gone now. It's gone now. So let's talk about something interesting.
All right. Let's talk about burnout.
Burnout. What do you know about burnout, Ben Black?
I know that it sounds an awful lot like depression, but people don't like calling it that.
Well, there's that.
This is from someone with a lot of both.
Well, there's been quite a few talks about some of this lately, and then a little bit of it got kicked off. John Willis wrote a blog post on the IT Revolution Press back, I don't know, it's been months now, but one of the guys that had been involved with some of the DevOps days, and especially in Los Angeles, which I just moved to, and I met him just a few times in passing, but he ended up committing suicide. And it's hard to know how that connects to everything else that goes on in our industry, but that kicked off like a bunch of discussion. And people have been talking about depression and burnout in the context of development and IT operations work for a while, but it seemed like it kind of came to a head with some of that. It's sort of a somber topic too.
Yeah.
So the reason you kind of brought this up a little bit is I just did a talk at DevOps Days Minneapolis, and it was like many of my talks, meandering random walk through a bunch of different topics. And one of the things that I try to kind of point out to people is the burnout is actually a feature of the system. Like we create systems that kind of force burnout in the way that we work. And I don't know if people really want to talk about it or how you go about even fixing that. But
can you give an example of like the logical sequence of structure that that turns into burnout from the system?
Well, we basically have a lot of organizational incentives that kind of entrench and elevate heroism and get in these cycles of compression and a lot of pressure to deliver certain things, and then that requires heroism, and then not to mention that all of us have lives and all this other stuff going on that also plays a factor. But
I'm totally jumping in.
Sure.
I just dropped the John Willis post into the chat. If folks want to go see that, maybe I'll tweet it out in a little bit. My little mantra is heroism doesn't scale, and that's true. But the problem with it is that it doesn't actually talk about the human cost that doesn't scale, because what I usually mean by it is that you can't sustainably operate a business based on heroism, right? Both because you're going to run out of people, but also because you'll burn them out, and that's the human cost that a lot of folks, a lot of us bear, and there's not a whole lot of ways to even have a conversation about it, right? Because it's great that people are finally talking a little bit about burnout. The problem is that burnout is vague, and burnout sounds like, oh, I'm just kind of tired and I need a vacation, and I'll be good as new in a couple of weeks. And to me, that's not burnout. I think everyone gets to that point where they need a little break and they need to go off and do something else and sort of refresh themselves. And maybe I just am personalizing it too much, but my view is that if a little bit of a vacation, a couple weeks of vacation gets you out of it, that wasn't actually burnout, because burnout is depression. And it sneaks up on you and it grinds you down, and sometimes it kills you. And that's what that post that John Willis put up is about, I think. That's my view on it. I sent him a note after he posted it because I thought it was a really important perspective, and getting people to at least recognize the problem, even if they still don't want to talk about it.
So then one of the points, like I said, I was all over the place talking about lots of stuff, but in the literature, is everyone familiar with Rat Park by any chance?
I'm not.
With what?
Rat Park. So everyone who grew up in the time I grew up, and probably a little bit before and a little bit after that, heard all these stories about the experiments that people did on rats, where you give them some drug and they did it with a bunch of different ones, but basically you put rats in these experiments, and then all of a sudden they're like, oh my God, the rats are all they do is take cocaine or heroin or whatever. So there's some little task that the subject will do, and they'll basically forego everything to do this drug. Well, it turns out that that's great if you put all the rats in the rat housing project, where they all live in a little tiny cage, a little cubicle, and there's really nothing else for them to do except for maybe run on a wheel and then take this drug. But if you turn all this on its head and you set up what they called Rat Park, which is another experiment someone did, and there's a bunch of other things people did with rats, and some of it gets rather depressing if you go think about how that or what that implies for humans in our society. But basically, Rat Park is you set up a bunch of open space, and the rats are free to do whatever they want. And there's other rats, and there's food, and there's things to do. And it turns out when you give them the opportunity to do a bunch of drugs, like most of the rats, if any of them will do it, other than just kind of as a passing thing. But they won't all become addicts, or none of them really become addicts. They just play, because hey, it's a good life here in Rat Park. Why do I need to be on drugs all the time? So I think that when you look at things in a context where you're you people are getting depressed or they're getting burned out, it's actually the whole context of the system, and not just that isolation, not just that. If you change some aspects of what's going on, you get very different results for everyone involved.
And we, taking it back to the context of our industry, we've arranged things in this way so that heroism is held up as the ultimate virtue, right? The leaders of these amazing companies are heroes, and people will often call them that explicitly, and it's just beaten into people constantly that the way to achieve that recognition of being a hero is to sacrifice everything and work all the time, and define yourself by these companies or these pieces of technology, and the end result is it's very easy to have isolation with people sitting right next to you.
I think it's particularly bad in the context of operations, where you basically have no visibility or no notoriety or no reward unless there's emergency. And I've even seen scenarios where in a company that is celebrating the release with all the developers literally having a party, there's an ops team that's on fire at the very same second trying to deal with whatever garbage was just put into production.
And you know that's totally true and very broken. I think that's actually the easiest part of that to deal with. To me, the hardest part of operations is the waiting, right? When you do a launch, you know things are about to go very, very wrong with almost certainty, right? But the rest of the time, any second, something could go horribly wrong, and you don't know what it is, and you don't know when it's going to happen. And so, you know, if you go too long in that mode, it grinds you psychologically, and you're in this state where, you know, it's sort of a light version of combat stress where, you know, at any second you think something horrible is going to happen and you start responding as if it does, or if, as if it is happening sometimes, right? Even when it's not. And to me, that's a huge source of the stress of those operational roles. And I think a big part of what people don't understand if they haven't had to go through that is that most of the time you are doing nothing, right? You're sitting there and you're staring at screens, or you're screwing around on Twitter, right? Because there's nothing but boredom in many cases in between everything going horribly, horribly wrong, and you are on fire, and then for the next 2 days or 2 weeks, you know, you don't really get to sleep. You don't really get to see anybody. You don't really get to do much of anything except, you know, feed yourself to this monster that has just broken.
And lots of caffeine, super healthy.
How much do you guys feel like the point you made about operations, like some people not being exposed to it? I mean, I have to admit that for the vast part of my career, I've had no interaction with people that have done operations, and really until working with the Cloud Foundry team, because most of the stuff I was doing wasn't, you know, if I was consulting, I was you know, building a project that wasn't in production yet, and then, you know, we hadn't turned it over to the client. But I was selling software for a while, so didn't see it there. And there wasn't really until I got to VMware, before we had a product, it was a hello world, you know, so no one really, you know, it wasn't that much of an emergency. It's only been after we really had commercial products in the hosted version and the on-premises stuff that I've actually kind of been more around it. But I think that's probably fairly common for people to not be exposed to this kind of what you're talking about, like this operations fire.
I mean, I think it just depends on the orgs you're in and what they ship. Anything that has to do with a service and delivering a service, I think there's a lot more operational responsibility than when you're shipping software, which is, I think, mostly what you've been involved with. The first time I was a developer by title, but as a consequence of other things and just my natural inclination to care about the product and the customer, I ended up taking on more and more responsible or operational responsibilities. It was like an online e-commerce platform thing that we were building around 2006. And then, as a consequence of getting involved with the Puppet project, and that really opened my eyes even more to this whole culture of operations, just really the domain of the product, so that, and we recognizing, and we're seeing the same thing from the Cloud Foundry perspective, only just evolved a few more years, where the actual technology changes the process so much, and it changes the way that these groups that maybe worked a different way, or, you know, have a process. It forces the issue of what those responsibilities are in a way that is actually a challenge to adopt it, and that was a big part of Puppet, especially. And I think in some regards that's why you have them all phase emerge, is because people recognize hey, there's this much better way to do this, and it's not all about the technology. It's actually the social engineering is as big a problem to solve as any of the technical problems.
So another aspect of this that I want to bring up, and maybe this is my imagination, but a lot of it seems very sort of machismo driven, right? I'm tough enough to do the 80 hours, or I'm tough enough to stay on call for a week or a month or whatever it is, right? Or I'm tough enough to stay in that heroism, it's got to ship tomorrow crunch time mode indefinitely, right? With no consequences whatsoever, right? And then I'm going to go out and get drunk, and that's going to not slow me down either because I'm tough, right?
I want to twist that a little bit and
do it.
I mean, there's a bunch of stuff that goes on in the industry, right? And there's been, we can come back. There's a bunch of these threads that just started in my head, but the industry's essentially gone from where all the IT stuff and all the programming stuff was considered kind of women's work. And I don't know if you guys are keeping score at home, but women are probably better at tolerating pain than men. Not that that's always the best virtue. And now, like, we have this industry where there's like a crisis because, one, we don't have enough people to do the work, and then, like, we're losing all the women. Like, women basically leave the industry for a bunch of reasons. But before we go to that topic, one of the things that I'm gonna drag a model just for the fun of it into this, and I'm gonna call it the StarCraft model of how you manage resources. And on one end of the spectrum, you kind of have the Zerg, and then the Terrans are kind of in the middle, and then the Protoss are sort of on the far end. And the Zerg basically have no concern for the loss of their units, or relatively little concern, especially in the early phases of this game. So you just make these big armies and you just throw them at the enemy, right? Where in the other end of the spectrum, you kind of have units that are you want to take better care of them. They have maybe more powers, if you will, but they're also you need to coordinate them better. You need to let them set them into circumstances where they can use what they're able to do. And if you just throw them against a Zerg that has no real concern for or consideration for the loss of its units, then you're going to be in a bad way. And I think that across the industry, from organization to organization and culture to culture, people manage their humans kind of on this spectrum too, where if you're on the end of the spectrum where the actual management doesn't have too much concern for the quote-unquote loss of the units that it's using to play the game, then you're probably going to see a lot of people that are burned out, or they churn through them in relatively short order. Where in some cultures where, and I'd probably put, I don't want to name any names on the Zerg spectrum, but if you look at what's going on, where people have talked about Netflix as a model, people that go to Netflix, they're kind of set up to be Protoss, right? They're very well paid, they're enabled, and they're allowed to kind of use their quote-unquote superpowers to build the future. And I think that, if you look at the spectrum across the industry, the way that plays out kind of has a lot to do with how burned out. Not that anyone at Netflix couldn't be burned out, but all these things sort of have a...
Closer to home, this is the lab's model, isn't it? Right? If the goal is maintain a sustainable pace and people actually work sort of normal human hours, and that's enforced, right? Like, there's a problem if someone is staying late all the time, and that is about sort of the mental state, right, of everyone in the organization, right? And essentially it's saying that the system works this way because it has to, right? Because this is just a constraint of humans, and that constraint is actually a hard constraint. All this burnout is because people try and pretend that it's not, that somehow it is sustainable to go
Yeah, well,
beyond.
let's describe what you're talking about, Ben. So
Go ahead.
you're talking. Yeah. Well, I think so. You said labs, and what you're referring to is Pivotal Labs. Is like for 25 years, Rob and me founded this thing that's been basically about client consulting, and slowly built up a business, and then eventually, like, we all merged together with Pivotal, brought enterprise software into it from VMware and EMC and stuff. But the Pivotal Labs is still a big part of Pivotal today, and it was just a really different the way the process that they use in the client consulting today is it's evolved, but now it's an inbound model primarily where clients come into Pivotal. But and I went through this experience of like working at VMware on Cloud Foundry and then coming up to a labs project in San Francisco where they were helping to build the UI for Cloud Foundry at the time. And it was a different experience for me because at VMware, everyone comes in at like 10 a.m., 11 a.m., noon, and then they're leaving at all kinds of different hours at different times. And Labs has this rigid process where it's like, hey, no, we're all going to come in at 9 a.m. and leave at 6 p.m. And they have some other reasons for it, for like things like extreme programming and pair programming and things like that. But a big part of the rationale for and I've heard Rob talk about this before, is that he actually believes it's better for the organization. He's optimizing for the best outcomes by having people go home at 6 p.m. Because even though you get this like short burst for a death march or something like that, where it's actually bad for the code base, it's bad for the people involved, and that's that's what when we still do Pivotal Labs does consulting today, that process is still around, and we're actually using it on Cloud Foundry we developed too, by the way. But it's essentially a big part of the labs culture that came from Pivotal Labs.
So just to put more logs on the fire, the mentality and the culture that kind of revolves around startups, and some of the stuff that I've been involved with startups that I've been either an employee or whatever at, is much more. It's much more. It's not heroism in the sense that you're like this Zerg that's kind of thrown to die on, but it's like you're the thing, right? Like you can't stop, or else no one will do it. And there's an infinite amount of things that need to be done if you want to kind of be quote unquote winning. And so coming from that mentality and seeing some of the stuff that goes on at Pivotal, and it's like sometimes there's a little bit of cognitive dissonance because I'm just like, why did people stop working? There's so much work to do, right? And so
it's a really competitive environment. Like this isn't. I have the same feeling. I work a lot. I know you guys work a lot. And so in some ways, like, I don't always model the behavior that I'm participating in the overall system, right? And when I think about it, though, like there's a pretty big difference in this like startup or cutthroat competitive environment where like people there's not gonna be everyone winning, right? There's only gonna be a couple of winners, and I sure want to be one of them. I want our customers to win with us, and and I love the work, so that kind of drives all of this too. But it is easy for it to get out of hand sometimes.
what do you think, Ben?
The aspect of it that was important to me, and that the reason I brought it up, is to show that there is another way, and that other way is successful too. I think a lot of there's this built-in assumption in the startup culture that if you don't do it this way, if you don't kill yourself, that you're going to fail. It's just inevitable that you will fail.
It's explicitly stated that.
Yeah. And there is another way to do it, and that way is much more humane, and it doesn't fail the way that everyone has been promised it would. It does mean different trade-offs. That's absolutely true. but it's trade-offs that are balanced in favor of the humans involved and in favor of their humanity. And so the end result is it's much less likely to produce burnout. I've never even heard of someone, I've never heard someone at Pivotal talk about burnout as something that they're experiencing in their job at Pivotal. And it's not to say it never happens, but the system itself is not structured to produce it with near certainty. And to me, that is a world of difference, and it's, I think, one of the most important things that people should learn from Pivotal Labs in particular, and from Rob Me, is that winning does not mean having to crush everyone in the company on the way to it.
I think it just requires being patient enough to play the longer game. And
yeah, patience is an important word that people forget a lot, right? They're like, yeah, you know, if I just work 80 hours a little bit, then, you know, I'll get there so much faster. And, you know, there are ancient proverbs about this, right? Like this is a solved problem in terms of philosophy and humanity, and yet within, you know, modern startup culture, it doesn't show up at all. Patience is not just not held up as valuable; it's actually held up as actively destructive and something to be avoided.
I think maybe every age has a bit of the dark ages in it. So is there a lighter topic we could, there's a bunch of founded stuff going on.
Well, what else happened at DevOps Days? You were just there, right?
You know, DevOps Days, I've been to a lot of them, and I didn't get to spend much time there. It was, I was invited to give this talk, and it was a 2-day conference, but I really just came in the night of the first day after it was already done, so I missed the whole day, and then we spent I watched a microservices talk from Mary Poppendick, who's, I don't know, one of my favorite people, at least for ideas. She's the person who wrote, together with her husband Tom, wrote the book on lean software development. Most of the ideas that are in the, if you read Mary's book and you read Steve Blank, you'll be way better off than if you read The Lean Startup. You could quote me on that. It's all derivative from the stuff those guys did.
I second that.
And she just, I've been exposed to her ideas since about 2007, 2008, and I've been a big fan, and I've seen her talk before, but it's interesting to see, you know, this kind of, the agile elite sort of pick up this microservices banner, and so she talked a little bit about that kind of stuff in her talk. There's a talk about the safety dance. All these are online too. The videos are online from the thing. So I watched the talks, and then in typical Little Idea fashion, I basically made my slides during the day to give my talk at noon. And then I did my talk, and then we did the open space, which was, you know, always a good time. The first open space was they wanted to do a podcast with me, so there's also a podcast that came out of that. It's the Arrested DevOps podcast with it's Bridget and Matt Stratton from Chef, and then I did on request from people. We played with Werewolf for one of the other open space, and then the last one I did a Cloud Foundry open space. So that was, and then I rushed off to go to my 2-day on-site with my team. So I didn't really get to take in the full DevOps days, but I tried to put a good little run there for the day.
Cool.
So I got happy stuff to talk about. That's right, OSCON.
OSCON's coming up. There's a bunch of stuff going on.
I'm reading your mind. So OSCON, Pivotal folks have 3 different events, presentations, workshops, what have you. 2 of them are actually IoT related, so I'll get to them last. Roman is doing a talk on scalable graph analysis, and so I'm going to drop each of these into the chat for folks.
I don't think people can see the chat.
Well, that's okay, because there's people who are joining us, and then I'm going to put this all in the Twitters later. I'm just using this as my notepad. Pardon me.
There you go.
So
you have a system.
More near and dear to my heart. So we have. I just called this IoT, but it's totally not. So it's Spencer Gibb, who's awesome, giving a talk on microservices with Spring Cloud and Netflix OSS, which is something in which we have invested huge resources to the point that Netflix may or may not be using some of the stuff that we have produced here. But if you want to do modern microservices the right way, you do not want to do it without using Spring Cloud and Netflix OSS. Anything else is sort of DIY microservices, and this is a real microservices platform, and everybody knows how I feel about that. So don't miss that. That is Tuesday, 9 a.m. And then the actual IoT one, Build Your First Internet of Things app with Fred Mello and Bill Marquito Oliveira. And my apologies for my pronunciation. Anyway, they're actually going to be building an IoT app. They're going to include sensors, tracking people moving through the venue using Raspberry Pis. It's actually kind of awesome. Showcases a bunch of different stuff that we've built. We've got Apache Geo, Spring XD, Cloud Foundry. There's even a little bit of Docker in there for those people who like that sort of thing. And that is also Tuesday 9 a.m. because scheduling is fantastic. So if you're doing IoT, go to this one. If you're doing microservices, go to the other one. If you're doing both, then you should go to both.
OSCON is a hard conference to go to, I think.
It's still my favorite.
Really?
Yeah. Maybe that's because I haven't been in like 5 years.
I think you might be projecting that.
In my mind, it's my favorite.
OSCON's fun because it's like the rainbow gathering of open source people, but it's not. It's kind of hard to learn things there, I think. And the thing I don't like about OSCON is no one has the same conference, which you might think is a feature, but I prefer conferences that are more intimate and have much more shared experience, personally. But it'll be fun. I mean, there's a lot of it's a big deal now. I mean, OSCON's got all the big logos. You know, obviously we're there. That was where OpenStack was announced. That was the last time you were at OSCON, I think. 2010, if I recall.
I think you're right. That in fact was me standing there as they were signing paperwork saying this is never going to work.
Well, let's talk about that briefly because someone posted a really interesting blog post. It was in some sense similar to something I posted a few years ago, but it was interesting to see their frustration, also connected back to our previous conversation, basically feeling that the project was disconnected from the operational reality, and his personal frustration with that fact and his attempts to have an impact on the project. And I don't want to read too much into it, but I think that based on some of the other stuff that we talked about, that was definitely if not burnout, definitely tapping out to the situation.
Yeah, that was a really interesting post. Yeah, and that it referenced the talk actually from the OpenStack Summit in Vancouver. Forget what it was called. Was it?
It was Turner's talk. It was Andy Smith talking about OpenStack is doomed, and
it's your fault.
It's your fault, and basically chronicling. You can watch that. It's a video. It's online. Basically chronicling a bunch of things that he thought were missteps in the in the way the project evolved from the beginning till now. And I mean, I worked with Termi, and I always thought he had a pretty good perspective, and I agree with 99% of what he said. And we just add that the majority of the reasons that OpenStack had problems and continues to have problems are almost all to do with the social engineering that is required to build good software. And when you have the politics and the business interests, that was the big thing that this guy was frustrated with, or that he made explicit, is that he felt OpenStack was largely just about the business development and not about the technology.
Well, he specifically said that the operators, right, were excluded or felt like less than seconds, at best second-class citizens.
Yeah, I mean, it was, to be clear, the whole game was rigged to produce that outcome. Like, the specific structure that was put into place, while people talked a lot about it being like Apache, it's nothing like Apache, and it's specifically intended to produce the result that it has, which is that the vendors are in total control, and there's no meaningful notion of a community of anyone who isn't a vendor, right? There are a couple of folks who represent the community in a board that is, a dozen people more at this point. Essentially anyone who paid enough money to get in there gets more of a say than the community, and that was intentional. I called it out. Other people called it out as they were putting that organization into place, and I don't know if they were in denial or if they just thought no one would notice, but it went through exactly in that way, and the result is completely predictable. It should surprise nobody that it's this big vendor fest, and it's totally unresponsive to the community, and it's kind of a disaster of cooks.
I think some of those critiques you could apply to the Cloud Foundry ecosystem, and I think the main difference that I see as a differentiator is the Cloud Foundry project. While there's a bunch of things I think we could do better from a community involvement perspective, is engineering centric.
Well, there is some truth to that, but I would also say that the biggest difference, and there's no nice way to say this, is that we have paying customers, and that keeps us honest in a way that you cannot get from a bunch of vendors sitting in a room together trying to figure out what to do, right? Because they are going to go for each other's throats at the expense of their customers every single time.
I think there's more to it than that, because plenty of people.
It's always complicated.
Plenty of people paid for OpenStack, right? There's plenty of OpenStack customers. So there's more. There's got to be more to it than that.
Well, you know what? You say that, but I don't think it is that easy.
Yeah, I actually, I'm not so sure.
I think there are some operators, and I would disagree with them paying for OpenStack, right? What was in that talk was a pretty clear articulation that anyone who's trying to operate OpenStack for real is forked. No euphemism, actually forking the project, and then not giving things back, right? And that started very early on. Very early on. It was an inevitable thing, right? But it started very early. And the idea that there are lots of paying customers for OpenStack, where's Nebula? No offense to Josh, but where's Piston? Right? There are this long list of companies, cloud scaling, right? All these companies that were supposed to be these huge wins based on OpenStack, and they just didn't happen. And they didn't happen because the customers aren't there.
I think having some insight, there's definitely paying customers to all those people you mentioned. Nebula, I would say that they didn't. Their strategy was flawed, and I just don't think the market is going to suffer the appliance model for for core infrastructure. And then if you look at Piston and cloud scaling and these people, the real thing there is I felt like Piston was trying to do real ambitious engineering. When I was working on the OpenStack project, they were trying to do, distributed consensus-based like updates and the kind
Their
of
installer, they did their own Linux.
They were managing their own kernel. It's like all this stuff that you want to be able to do that you think is a great idea. Piston was trying to do that. The problem was Piston didn't have the hundreds of millions of dollars that it would take to actually do that right, to do that well. So while I think Josh had the clearest, far-reaching vision for what should be possible and what should be done with a project like OpenStack, they never had the critical mass of engineering, core engineering resources to actually pull it off faster than the rest of the and whatever. Like anyone who's ever tried to upgrade OpenStack knows that it's basically a rewrite every time. So,
but that again actually goes in support of what I'm saying, which is here you have the most technologically ambitious vendor, and they're really pushing some sophisticated stuff. You look at what's in OpenStack, and for the most part, it ain't. And yet, they couldn't get much traction in people adopting that stuff.
Adoption and sales are very, very different.
I understand. But I'm just saying, even within the OpenStack community, they had difficulty getting people to even adopt it into the project, right?
Because sales and engineering are not the same monster. Here, let's like actually tell an OpenStack story, and this is something that kind of connects back to your story as well. You might recall a man by the name of Chris Pinkham, who was, unless you listened to Andy Jassy, somewhat responsible for EC2 from the kind of leadership perspective. And Chris Pinkham had a startup, Nimbula, right around the same time. And when I was at Cloud Scaling, I was evaluating a bunch of the different stuff going on. And initially we were mostly doing services. And when as long as Nimbula thought we were going to be kind of a systems integrator consulting role, then they were more than willing to share what they were doing, and thought we could help them go to market. And what Nimbula was doing was probably better than anything that OpenStack was doing. They didn't have the mass of the community or whatever right now, but their vision and their execution were pretty good, but they didn't have an open source model, and they didn't have the literally hundreds of millions of dollars that it takes to build this software the right way. And as soon as OpenStack became the marketing machine that it continues to be today, that sucked all the oxygen out of any conversation that those guys could have with anyone. So while they're what I would consider technically superior from the product perspective, they had zero chance to go to market against the noise that OpenStack created in the infrastructure to service solution layer.
Well, didn't a lot of the Eucalyptus people feel the same way? That they had, more stable, more production grade ready technology, but once all the oxygen got sucked out of the room, they're having a hard time competing.
I mean, absolutely. But to be fair to Eucalyptus, like that was their own doing. OpenStack would not have ever existed without Eucalyptus mismanaging their own opportunity. And you can basically draw direct lines from Eucalyptus refusing to allow the project to evolve because they had intended to monetize the enterprise version of Eucalyptus with certain features, and so when the people from the community started implementing those features and trying to push them upstream, then Eucalyptus really wouldn't. It like basically blocked its own potential and subsequently created OpenStack by refusing to be a real community open source project. So once OpenStack became the rolling marketing machine, then yeah, anyone in that space, what's it called? There's Open Nebula, I think it's called. It's like the Europeans people still use it a little bit. Cloud Stack, while it also had technical problems, is arguably more production ready. I mean, that's sort of a euphemism, but people say it. I deployed both Cloud Stack and OpenStack, and from I think there's architectural things I would want to do different than Cloud Stack did, but you could count on the thing to kind of run. It wasn't always kind of shifting sands where OpenStack was always hard. You basically had to feed it with blood to keep it up. Anyway, such a delightful conversation that we're having tonight.
Yeah, I don't know, maybe it's too hot. It's late at night. The ice.
Well, I mean, despite all of the, I guess, frustration that you hear occasionally about OpenStack, there still are quite a few customers of even Pivotal that are very interested in it and actually running it. I think that many of the ones that I'm aware of that are successful doing it have they're just large enough and can have a big enough team and dedicated enough resources and time and commitment to it to make it successful. And we did, I've heard from even some of those customers that are large enough to do that. I've heard that there's a little bit of fatigue with that, but then I think it's kind of like you can't really have it both ways. Some of them really like the flexibility of being able to choose and pick and match their stack, and so that's kind of comes with the territory.
Where I've seen people have success is where there's relatively mature web operations already. Some of these organizations that try to adopt OpenStack, they'd have a hard time keeping a 5-node Rails cluster up, and now all of a sudden they're trying to manage all their infrastructure on this distributed infrastructure as a service thing. But people that have seen real web operations, then they can make OpenStack work. There's a couple good examples that are out there, but they have also constrained their process to be relatively happy path, where they're using what I've seen be the most successful is they're trying to do like provisioning for their web app. So like Mercado Libre is a large e-commerce. It's kind of like eBay / Amazon in Latin America. And I think it's in, let me say Argentina or Brazil or something. It's late, or I remember, but they had a very fascinating talk actually talking about refactoring their e-commerce platform into a microservice architecture at Velocity a year ago, and it was all the same stuff, like the microservice architecture, the cultural changes, how the cultural or the organizational hierarchy mirrors the structure of the application, and vice versa. And it was a really good talk. And they were running OpenStack, but they basically run OpenStack to provision nodes on this cluster for the microservices. Like they're not a service organization that's running infrastructure as a service for random IT. They have a very narrow thing. Okay, it's like one AMI basically that we're going to use to build this thing for our web app. And those kind of narrower happy path constrain the problem tend to be more successful than, like, once you start to pull in all the projects in that ecosystem, they're not even compatible with each other. So you start to like, oh well, what will run Keystone 3.0? Half the projects.
And I think that's actually a good lesson in general. I mean, it's especially acute with really complicated projects like OpenStack, but you have to keep the scope narrow when you're going into these things, or you're just going to doom yourself. And when things are as complicated and as fast moving as OpenStack is, I think it's almost impossible to make it go without an enormous investment or a really narrow scope. And you're talking about one of the happy paths, and that's certainly true. I do think that the industry, and this is definitely not an OpenStack thing, but the industry is really, focused on some survivorship bias, and that's for companies as well as for customer success stories. Nobody wants to talk about what didn't work. And a customer who puts out a press release about their incredibly successful deployment of whatever piece of software is not going to put out another press release to explain that 18 months later they still haven't gotten it working, and so they're ditching it, right? That never happens. So instead, people just see the trumpeting of success right at the beginning, and that's what they assume reality is.
Well, I think that plays out in macro and in micro. So you look at the history of this ecosystem, and this is one of the things that I like the stewardship model of Cloud Foundry. While it might be frustrating for some aspects, it's like all these projects that were created in OpenStack ecosystem, they all trumpeted their creation. They all got project leads. I think they started to stop doing that, but each one of them sort of became celebrated for existing, not for ever making anything work. And so then they all have a release cycle and they ship on a date, but then none of them actually work together because they're not really incentivized to work together. And they're really just about that demo that they worked on their laptop, and it's like, oh, this little code works. But anyone who's kind of trying to put that all together to make an actual service and operate as a service, the quote-unquote operator that we referenced the blog post from earlier, they're just sort of left kind of picking up the pieces and trying to make it all work without the benefit of the celebration.
And I would say that there's another aspect to that bias, which is sometimes it really is successful, and it's really successful because a really incredible group of folks succeeded with it. And there's this weird bias that if this super smart, super skilled, super experienced group of folks who happen to also get very lucky could succeed with this piece of technology, then the team that you have solving a totally different problem that you have could absolutely do exactly the same thing, right? And that gap between sort of the norm of what you can expect from the team versus these really remarkable teams that sort of converge sometimes, that gap is very, very wide, and again, doesn't show up in press releases and even in conference talks. To toot our own horn and maybe say something positive, because I feel like we're being very negative on a lot of these things. That's one of the things I love about having so many different customers talking at CF Summit or other events about how they've succeeded, because often Cloud Foundry plays kind of a minor supporting role in their success, right? Essentially, we help them with the organizational change that was required in order for them to transform their business. And the Cloud Foundry platform allowed them to do that. We sort of opened the door to them. And so what they're talking about is that organizational change. And the thing about organizational change is you cannot fake it. And that's more than a press release. You're not going to put a press release out about your amazing organizational change, right? That has to be real, or they're not going to be out there talking about it. And so that's what actually makes me most happy when I hear customers talking about things, is when they talk about the things that have nothing to do with the technology that have allowed them to succeed.
Well, with that, you told me you had to go to a meeting at midnight.
No, that was me messing up the spelling. So.
You don't have a meeting at midnight?
No, it's actually at 6:20 a.m. on Tuesday.
Well, that's pretty close to Sunday midnight.
You know what? Me and Central European Standard Time do not have a good relationship. I'm not on speaking terms with that time zone.
I'm pretty bad at time zone math in general. When you start to juggle around a number of the Asian and European time zones, I get quite confused myself. Oh, and then throw in some daylight savings. Good times.
I don't even know what day it is. All right. Well, I don't think we have any secrets. This was too grim all the way through, and
let's make
I feel like next time I see McKenty, he's gonna punch me or something. Or just maybe look at me real hard.
Let's have another 5 minutes of happy stuff. Only happy stuff.
Only happy stuff.
Happy stuff.
I'm pretty happy about some spring stuff. I had a little Josh Long over at my house the other day, and Spring Boot's pretty cool.
Spring Boot is pretty amazing, and you know that that demo that Phil did with the live reloading of modules in a running app, that was pretty awesome. People should totally watch that video again. Just worship at it. You know, we didn't have CFAD last week, did we?
No.
Yeah. So I was in San Francisco 2 weeks ago now, I guess, and we did some awesome work around container networking, and very excited about the progress there. That'll be something that'll be a lot of community discussions in the near future, I expect, but I am stoked to bits about that, and actually spent a lot of time with Josh McKenty going through it, and although he told me at the beginning that we were totally not going to agree, I feel like we agreed anyway, so that was a good moment.
So there, Josh.
Josh, I'm giving you a hug right now. You and I are in the same boat.
Here's a secret we probably can't tell, but we're probably going to hire someone else.
Do not tell that secret. That'll be a secret for CFAD next week.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It might It might be longer than next week. Actually.
I'm going to take us off the air if you keep getting close to telling real secrets.
I'm pretty excited about it, though.
Yeah, I am beside myself.
So without that secret, what do you think about distributed tracing built into a platform?
I think that's exciting. You know, I've been doing a bunch of collaboration with folks in that community. That's why I've been tweeting a bunch about it. You know, Adrian Cole just did a big move of the Zipkin code base over to the open Zipkin repos, meaning it's sort of a standalone thing rather than a vendor-controlled project, which I think is great for the community.
So for the kids at home, tell them what Zipkin is.
Zipkin is a distributed tracing, app tracing framework that Twitter built as sort of a clone of Google's Dapper. There's a paper on Dapper that you should read. It's very interesting. There's a whole lot of interesting distributed tracing stuff going on, but that model really kind of hit a sweet spot in how things are represented and how you interact with them, and I guess how simple it is to implement it, honestly. But there are a bunch of different implementations of Dapper-like things that have emerged between Zipkin and Brave and htrace. And so Adrian actually put together a little workshop that Matt Stein and I participated in as well, to sort of bring together a bunch of folks working in distributed tracing in one way or another, and figure out how we can act more like a single community, and you know, how we converge on certain core components and concepts, such that pieces from these different projects can actually, you know, work together or provide a similar experience.
So what does distributed tracing do, and what problem does it solve for me?
Yeah, so distributed tracing allows you to see, like, request by request, what exact set of services were called in sort of a tree of dependencies in order to satisfy that request and produce a response. So, you know, an HTTP request comes in at the front, you tag it with a trace ID, and you have these notions of these things called spans, which are sort of an execution time frame for a given component, and spans are organized into this hierarchy, this tree, because things in one span will call other things, which will in turn produce new spans. So, for example, you have your Rails app, and It calls a database, and you can imagine that the database call itself is a new span. That's a new thing happening over a certain amount of time.
For example, a microservice architecture. It makes sense.
I'm getting there, man. I'm taking the long way around. So, in the sort of abstract, the idea is, hey, you can actually see exactly what's happening for a given request. This database call took longer than I expected. I'm going to zoom in on that. Maybe I'm missing an index, whatever it might be. So it allows you to zero in on a problem really quickly. In more sophisticated systems like microservice architectures, cloud-native architectures, it moves from something that's cool to something that's almost essential to do effective operations, because then you no longer have this monolith that you can sort of attach a debugger to and watch step through what it's doing. Instead, the distributed tracing system gives you that sort of step-by-step view through your whole distributed app. So you can see, hey, the call to my auth service, or the call to my user account service, or whatever it might be. That's actually the thing that's having a problem, and so I'm going to look right there as one example. I take a very operationally focused approach to this, but obviously there's very important performance implications, because you can actually see what's taking what time. You can see what's failing, of course. There's all sorts of interesting outcomes from having all of that distributed tracing data. And historically, the problem has been that in order to really make use of things, even like Zipkin, you had to do a lot of customization to make it work in your environment. And what I'm hoping is really the top outcome of this work that Adrian has gotten started is that the barrier to entry for people using distributed tracing becomes so low that everyone can do it. That's going to take a lot of effort, and I actually think that it's very hard to do if you're not targeting specific environments. And so, Spencer Gibb, who I mentioned earlier, along with a number of other folks in the Spring team, have done a lot of great work to integrate tracing into Spring. And that, to me, is one of the critical aspects of this, is getting away from users having to do a lot of the instrumentation themselves and really integrating it into the platform. And obviously, we want to take that further, and we'll see where that goes.
Sounds like a plan. I think it'd be really exciting if you could just, deploy microservices to the platform and have distributed tracing. That'd be great.
Do what?
If you could just deploy your microservices to the platform and have distributed tracing be the future of the platform.
That's a great idea. That's some vision that you're showing right there. I like that.
Someone should build that.
Yeah. All right.
It got happier. It got happier.
I think we're good.
Distributed tracing makes everyone happy.
I mean, I'm still hoping on Josh, a hug from Josh. Maybe later.
So Josh is great whenever you could talk about things besides OpenStack.
I think he's great all the time. I just don't want to have OpenStack conversations with him.
Josh is in fact great all the time.
There you go. Okay. Well, I'm going to call it. Thank you, everybody, for a late CFAD, and hope everyone in the morning has a cup of coffee and a bright outlook for this very dark evening that we've provided you.
We're here to help.